So first of all, I want to thank Bruce Alderman for inviting me to offer some thoughts for this integral entheogens series. Psychedelics, or entheogens, or ecodelic substances, as Richard Doyle calls them. There's so many different names for these fungal and vegetal and chemical substances because their effects are so multifaceted. What I want to share in this brief video are three things, really. First, some biographical details about how I have personally come to relate to these, I'll call them alchemical catalysts. And then I want to share some philosophical insights that I would say, or at least appear to me to have arisen from my psychedelic experiences. So in other words, what are the ontological, not conclusions, but ontological suggestions that have arisen from my psychedelic experiences? What is reality if these types of experiences are real? So the biographical, the philosophical, and then I want to offer some prescriptions. Humble prescriptions that I think might be of both psychological and sociological, cultural, might be of service, might be aids, suggestions about how we might weave these alchemical catalysts, these sacred medicines back into our cultural lives in a way that can heal some of the collective and personal traumas that life in modern civilization seems to presuppose. So, biographically, psychedelics have played an absolutely crucial role in my own self-understanding, in my own philosophical path, and in my own spiritual practice. So I didn't encounter any drug, really, not even alcohol, until I was about 18, which is older than most Americans, I think, certainly older than Europeans and other people who are exposed to alcohol much younger. The United States is this weird place where legally we have these prohibitions, like you can't drink until you're 21. You can go to war for 3 years already, but you can't drink yet. So my first experience drinking was as a senior in high school. I didn't care for it too much. And then also as a senior in high school, I smoked cannabis for the first time. And this was a far more interesting experience to me. While alcohol, I could see it can be fun because of how it lowers inhibitions. All of a sudden, you're the most confident person in the world. And as an introvert, I could see how it could be useful for going to parties. But it wasn't that interesting to me at an existential level. Cannabis, on the other hand, the way I described it at the time was that it allowed me to become a child again. And the habitual categories that I had grown used to viewing the world through and interpreting the world in terms of, they fell away. Those categories, they became quite funny to me. I mean, like a clock and a calendar. One of the first times I got high, I stared at a clock. I considered, I flipped through a calendar, and I was looking at these attempts to quantify time as absurd and hilarious. I was cracking up and just recognizing how constructed these categories are, and how before I had been high, before I had experienced, it's like what Eric Davis calls high weirdness. And, cannabis is just the entryway into the levels of weirdness that one can experience. But to look at the clock and the calendar, to recognize how constructed those are, they're not real, their ideas. And what was real for me in these moments, experiencing, cannabis for the first time, was the sense of wonder, that reality was not well understood, actually. And, another thing besides clocks and calendars that cracked me up was looking at money, a dollar bill, and just, again, seeing how constructed its reality is. And so cannabis was, I think, one of the reasons that I became a philosophically curious person. I was already trending in that direction as an 18-year-old and starting to read, Alan Watts and D.T. Suzuki, and I was really getting into Eastern mysticism, having rejected my sort of Judeo-Christian, my dad's Jewish, my mom's Christian, a kind of Protestant form of Christianity. I didn't go to a particular church as a kid. I did go to preschool in a temple as part of a Jewish community center, not at JCC, but just, to use the term community generally. So I had this mixed upbringing, and I could never take the monotheistic tradition, the biblical tradition that was taught to me as a child, seriously. So as a teenager, I turned east for something more esoteric, and then I took psychedelics. And so cannabis at 18, I didn't have a proper psychedelic. I mean, I think cannabis can be psychedelic if used properly, but my first proper psychedelic was psilocybin mushrooms as a 19-year-old. And I had been reading McKenna, so, I took them in my room alone in the evening. And I encountered the Logos, Jesus Christ, basically had a conversation with Jesus. And this was after having really rejected and even belittled and kind of made fun of Christianity as just the height of arrogance and stupidity. And so then Jesus talks to me, and I realize I can't escape this religious sort of archetypal unconscious that is just part of me because of where I come from and who I am. And that shifted my whole spiritual path. I didn't, turn away from Buddhism and Taoism and Eastern mysticism. I just turned to also recognize the deeper esoteric dimensions of not only, the biblical religions, but of Western philosophy, and realized that, if you look more deeply, there's actually the same sorts of things being said that I was appreciating about what the Taoists were saying and what, Buddhists were saying. So I reconnected with this other part of myself as a result of this first psychedelic experience. I stopped reacting against a very exoteric form of my own cultural inheritance, looked more deeply, and as a result, I think, experience myself now as more whole and less reactive, more compassionate about all of the different cultural forms that are present in our world today and in myself. So my first experience with mushrooms was, again, crucial, right? It's clearly, for me, in my own biography, a pivot point. Later, I would try LSD and ayahuasca and DMT, and the philosophical insights continued to flow from these experiences. And so, MDMA also, I think, has been important for me. There's developmental markers. Usually the first time I try one of these substances, each one's unique and different, right? We have a class of drugs called psychedelics, but each one of these alchemical catalysts is unique, right? It has unique effects. And each one of us is unique. Our set and setting will be different. And so when we ingest one of these unique drugs, our unique situation and soul, our unique soul situation, if you will, is going to also bring novelty to the experience. So we have to I think, not rush to presume that our categories for these substances and experiences necessarily fit all that they are. So rather than go through each experience with these different substances, I want to shift to the philosophical significance. Because, for me, nowadays, 15 years after, my first psychedelic experiences, I have adopted, as loose sort of orienting generalizations, a couple of philosophical principles or ideas, and one of them is panpsychism, and there are many varieties of panpsychism, but the basic idea would be that whatever consciousness is, whatever its experiential ground or matrix is, it's not reducible to something called matter that would be not experiential or conscious to any degree. Whatever our conscious experience is, and I think my psychedelic trips, to use a popular trope, we could call them journeys, we could call them experiences, but that makes them feel inner and simply located, where I think trip actually gives you that sense of, sailing out into the open ocean, not being sure where you're going to end up, and discovering new territories. These are inward journeys, but that aren't just inward in that, when you reach, I forget who said this, but when you reach the floorboards of the soul, they actually peel open and you look through, and it's the stars in heaven that you thought were above you. There's a trap door inside yourself that leads you right back up there. And the psychedelic experience is revelatory of this type of strange loop, if you will, the recursive structure of reality. And I connected this to the Madhyamaka Buddhist notion of dependent co-origination, where all things are empty of inherent form because their form arises in relation to every other. And so that it's not that there is form, it's that all forms are empty. But emptiness itself is form, is the relational matrix in which form arises. So psychedelics force these insights upon you. They really do, grab you and compel you to accept that your ego and reality are not two separate things, and that we are in fact in direct contact with an infinite divine ground all the time, everywhere. We're always in contact with that. A properly mediated psychedelic experience can reveal that to you, and from that point forward, you can't deny it. You might begin to forget the intensity of the experience, but what it pointed you toward remains present with you afterwards. And the recent university studies of psilocybin for end-of-life anxiety and other things, when they interview the people who took psilocybin months, years later, the effects, the spiritual edification is obvious, that there's a clear sense of having shifted one's perspective and changed one's life as a result of what was experienced. Because what is experienced is overwhelming to the ego, who imagines that they inhabit a world of other people that is entirely separate from them, and that their essence somehow transcends everything else. This notion of panpsychism is an attempt to get us out of our heads, and not just back into our bodies, but back into the interbeing of all bodies. And I think psychedelic experiences can be profoundly disturbing when we don't let go of the egoic structure of separation, because all of a sudden what you thought was private um, gets ripped open and all the light floods in, and the shadow becomes apparent. And if you're not ready, to do the psychological work that will erupt as a result of taking psychedelics in a growth-enhancing setting, if you're not ready to look at the psychological shadow, you're not going to be able to encounter the spiritual light, because these two things, it turns out, are not separate things. And so philosophically, not only would I want to suggest that, panpsychism seems to follow naturally from psychedelic journeying, I think pluralism, a sense of the multiplicity of reality, and the differential repetition that is intrinsic to becoming. So pluralism for me, I think for integrally informed thinkers, when I say pluralism, you might hear green meme, but I hope that my pluralism is not just a green sort of plurality, but is an integral form of plurality. I think, if it's about transcending and including, the integral structure of consciousness is not going to be monist as opposed to pluralist. It's going to include the profound significance of pluralism. And what that profound significance is it's deeper, I think, than a sort of multiculturalism, where there are many perspectives on reality, one reality, many perspectives on one reality. That's a shallower form of pluralism, I think, merely multiculturalism, because it's still imagining a unified nature beneath, or a unified God beneath, if you prefer, if you're a theist instead of a naturalist. But a sense of oneness beneath the manyness, that's what multiculturalism seems to imply for me. The idea that we just need to be totally inclusive of different cultures, because they all have some perspective on the one underlying nature. This is an idea that, Bruno Latour, of course, has critiqued, and he's certainly influenced my perspective on this. But there's a deeper pluralism, though, that has to do not just with multiple perspectives on one reality, but that is an ontological pluralism. There are multiple worlds, and some worlds are more independent of other worlds. No world is totally independent. However, worlds have semi-permeable boundaries. Sometimes they run into each other and they both pop and are gone. Sometimes they run into each other and a symbiotic emergence takes place and a totally new world is brought forth. Other times, two worlds are rubbing up against each other or even interpenetrating, and they don't recognize it yet. Or maybe they only do in a subtle, mostly unconscious way. So to say that there are multiple worlds doesn't mean that they're each an independent monad. They're in relational processes, and that there is a process of becoming. And here the influence of Whitehead comes into the picture for me. There's a process of becoming, but it is epical in nature. Whitehead says atomic, but don't think of, Newtonian atoms. Think of drops of experience with aim and purpose and telos, and drops that are not closed off to a past and the future, or closed off from other drops, but that internally relate to every other drop, and that are open to the past and also open to the future, thrown, as Heidegger might say. So these multiple worlds that I would point us towards are not, like Leibniz's monads, where all their windows are closed, or there are no windows. Whitehead's actual occasions of experience that compose the pluriverse are, they're all window, if you want. They're constituted by their feelings of all the other occasions in their environment, and by the aim that they realize. So this sense of panpsychist and pluralistic reality for me has followed from my psychedelic experiences, because, just to give one example, with DMT, after, smoking it, ingesting it, within, maybe a few big hits, within a few seconds, I'm in a completely different world, particularly when I close my eyes. I still feel a thin tether back to this body, but my mind has been launched out of Earth orbit into some other hyperdimensional space. From a Christian contemplative perspective, we might want to talk about the angelic hierarchies. I mean, that's what it kind of feels like when I'm up there. When I open my eyes on TMD, I start to see the elemental beings present here in finite space-time. There's like a lattice work to space, and I can see the patterning, and these, what were angels with my eyes closed become sort of elves, as McKenna put it, or fairies that are sculpting the visible world around me, and then gradually, within 10 or 15 minutes, the DMT wears off, and I'm back in the normal physical, psychological reality of my habitual existence and perceptual capacity. And all I can do is remember that I saw different worlds while under the influence of this alchemical catalyst. I saw different worlds. I was in different worlds. And I'm changed as a result of that experience, because the physical, psychological world of the modern rational worldview has been forever relativized after an experience like that. So these are some of the philosophical implications for me that have come out of my psychedelic work. As far as prescriptions go, this is not enlightenment in a pill. And I don't want to be naive in the way that, say, the 1960s countercultural revolution was naive. And, Leary's mantra, turn on, tune in, drop out, I think oversimplified things. And I wouldn't want to give people the impression that psychedelics are just a cure-all. But in the proper set and setting, with the proper support, they can be profoundly transformative. They can be healing psychologically, because they force us to look at our own wounds. And when we hold the container of a ceremony, and we ingest these things, an ayahuasca ceremony, a mushroom ceremony, and we hold counsel together in that state, profound cultural and collective healing can take place. The intention has to be there, and that's independent of the substance. But the substance enhances the alchemical container, intensifying the transformation that is possible. And I think our society is in desperate need for this type of medicine. Our rituals, religious rituals, they fall flat. They speak to us at a merely moral or intellectual level. If we brought mushrooms back into the mass in the Christian churches, imagine what might be possible. because the history of religion is full of, to put it crudely, drug use. And in the modern period, there's been this prohibition, this rejection of the idea that being in relationship to plant medicines can somehow be of spiritual significance. The Christians came over to the Americas and really needed, one of the first things they felt they needed to do was eliminate these ayahuasca traditions and mushroom traditions, and to force that underground, except tobacco. They like that because again, it fosters a different kind of consciousness that Christians were down with. But these other substances didn't. And why is that? And we need to lift the prohibition in order to heal the bifurcations that are endemic to the modern condition, which are the source of so many of our problems. That there's other problems, but that are even more ancient. We need to heal those too. But I think we lost a connection to these psychedelic states culturally because of a modern prohibition and a repressive kind of consciousness. And I think the sooner we can alleviate that by reconnecting with these substances in a culturally sanctioned ritual way, something like the Mysteries of Eleusis, where there was a initiation rite open to everyone that involved a transformation in consciousness, that involved going through the death rebirth mystery, because only after you've gone through that at a personal individual level can you philosophically intuit the nature of God, so that God is no longer an idea that you might believe in or not, but God is a matrix that you have lived through. God is you're inside of it, and your very existence depends on the presence of that infinite being as not just noun but verb. I think the properly mediated psychedelic experience reveals being to you, and the seemingly simple questions like, who am I and what is this, are never the same again. So these existential insights and the potential for cultural healing makes psychedelics something we should be paying very close attention to, something we should be working with carefully. But there's great promise in these substances, and I think it's great news that there's been a return to these substances in academia, in medicine. I think we need to not let medicine monopolize the use of psychedelics, but push deeper in our religious institutions for these alchemical catalysts to have a role to play. So those are some thoughts. I'd be happy to engage in dialogue with you here under this video, or you can always reach out to me via email or at my blog. So thanks for your attention.